Good morning and welcome to the Field's COVID-19 seminar. I'm going to hand you over to our director, Kumar Murthy.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody to the weekly seminar. I hope you, wherever you are in the world, you're keeping safe and healthy and happy. And those of you who are working on this problem, that you're being very productive and working hard on how you can help the world get past this pandemic. Today, we're very pleased to have as our speaker, Professor Hiroshi Nishiura from Kyoto. He's a well-known figure in epidemiology. He's presently at the Kyoto University School of Public Health, but he has also been at Imperial College, Tuebingen, Utrecht, and Hong Kong, working on at various times on epidemiological issues. His research interests span the areas of statistical epidemiology, of infectious diseases, epidemiological modeling, and biomathematical formulation of the transmission dynamics of infectious diseases. So he's very well qualified to share some ideas about COVID-19 in Japan. Professor Nishiura.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Kumar Murthy and Professor Chen Hongwoo for organizing this lecture series and also for inviting me to give a talk. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to check if you see my slide on your screen. Do you see my screen?
It's very well.
We do.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me start what I'm supposed to talk. So I'm going to spend the next 47 minutes to share what we have got during the last 8 months in Japan. So here is a list of collaborators who worked with me on modeling. So those who are not accompanied by any affiliation represent those who worked in my department. And in addition to the department members, we collaborated with Robin Thompson at Oxford, Akira Endo and Sumire Sorano at the London School of Hygiene. Takeshi Miyama is from Osaka Institute of Public Health. Kenji Mizumoto from Kyoto University. Hiroaki Murayama is actually the undergrad student at the Medical University. And Ryosuke Omori is from Hokkaido University. And in addition to the group of modelers who are enumerated here, we worked with the Tohoku University members and also Dr. Tomoya Saito at the National Institute of Public Health, Koji Wada and Hiroaki Miyata, all of whom we had an interaction at within the building of the Ministry of Health. So to begin with, I'd like to show these photos. You know, that the first few months of our time in Japan was somewhat quite special. During the last decade, when I experienced the continuous feedback of mathematical modeling findings to the policy making of Ministry of Health, our distance was not that close. And it was very rare for us to have had the direct interaction with the people at the ministry to continuously work on the modeling and its feedback. But once the epidemic started in this time, especially from the late February, we were invited by the Minister of Health directly, Minister of Health Kato, proposed to launch the emergency operating center that is composed of mathematical modeling expert and also epidemiologists to work on the risk analysis in real time so that our feedback is not delayed, and also to ensure that everyone receives our modeling model-based knowledge without any delay, and also very closely with the information of the advantage, disadvantage, and also that to inform them about any drawback of the modeling. And so we stayed within the building of the Ministry of Health, on 11th and 12th floor, we had our own office there, where we were forced to work on our own laptop. And so our calculation capacity was not that strong. But this was the first instance at which that modelers occupied a single room, and we had continuous lectures to the Minister of Health for his policy making. And so to introduce what we got during the past 8 months, I'd like to separate the time events into 3 different parts. So first part was the most fancy part around which we were able to focus on our own original research. However, once the epidemic was intensified, we had to work within the building of the Ministry of Health from late February up until the end of June. And since July, we have worked in Hokkaido and also Kyoto to boost the research a little more than the time period when we were inside the ministry building. So before the ministry, as you share that almost the same experience, we were focused on sort of the science, you know, that on the very last day of 2019, we received the news that there was an announcement of the emergence of the viral pneumonia. And that we wondered if this is a disease X that WHO has prepared to respond. And based on the exported cases, how many cases do we expect in Wuhan? And was it a zoonotic origin, and so on? You know, the principal scientific questions we were able to answer from our lab in Hokkaido. For instance, this figure shows the initial exercise that our team has done along with Robin Thompson. So based on the fragmented information of the news, for instance, the Professor K.Y. Yuen of the University of Hong Kong flew to Wuhan, and he announced that it's not a bacterial disease, and that white blood cell count is reduced, indicating that it's probably the viral infections. And collecting that type of fragmented information, even the clinical information, and also that exposure data of the aggregated case data, we wondered if we can calculate the probability that the disease X that we have in the news is what it is actually caused by the novel pathogen. And we had some comparable diseases like MERS, SARS, both of which are caused by the coronavirus, influenza, and other respiratory viruses can be immediately enumerated. And as time went by, the fragmented information increased in their quality and also the amount. And as we received that type of information, the posterior probability that the disease is novel and actually caused by the new virus has increased as a function of time by taking the distance of the information from other diseases. And as time went by, in a matter of 10 days, we came to be almost sure that this was caused by a new novel virus, especially the novel coronavirus, only from the fragmented information. And in the beginning, we wondered if it was successfully contained at the source. And during the first 10 days, I think you may also remember that the majority of cases shared the exposure at the seafood market in Wuhan. Yeah. And the number of cases who were confirmed and reported was limited to 41 in total. But once the Thailand diagnosed the exported case on 13th of January, our impression has immediately changed. In the beginning, based on the 41 and based on the information of the exposure to the seafood market in Wuhan, we wonder if it's, for instance, a food-borne illness that has just emerged. And we even had some doubt. We even didn't have the serious doubt about the human-to-human transmissibility. But following the exportation to Thailand, we had an importation to Japan reported on the 16th of January. That was the second exported case outside of the mainland China. And it came to our attention that, definitely the reported count of 41 is underestimated in China. And our view has immediately changed. And based on that reported count that has grown as a function of time, we started to estimate the actual incidence in Wuhan. That was the first real-time study that we decided to implement. And here the 13 is given that when we implemented that study with the latest number, there were 13 exported cases outside of mainland China. And in the end, it was estimated that about a matter of 2,000 to 4,000 cases must have existed by the middle of the January in the province of Funan. Yeah. And as the time went by, our research in the beginning was quite normal. So that we are the group of the mathematical and statistical modeling, and especially our expertise is mostly focused on the use of the biomathematical formulation to derive the likelihood function to handle the empirical dataset. And therefore, the first approach we did was to clarify the natural history of infection. For instance, the top two panels shown in this slide represents the time delay distribution from illness onset to reporting, and also the time delay from illness onset to death. And these distributions are clarified and quantified explicitly so that we can use those generalized distribution to estimate other parameters. For instance, the bottom two panels shows the estimate of the case fatality ratio among the confirmed cases. So using the time delay distribution with a mean of about 19 days from illness onset to death, we were able to estimate that the confirmed case fatality risk was on the order of 5 to 7% in Wuhan. And subsequently, this is our graduate student, Natalie Linton, has done with our colleagues. We collected the fragmented individual data set so that we can compose the line list on our own. And interesting feature of the man-made self-collected line list that is manually collected by the researcher from the open source information is that we can identify some subgroup of individuals with very good precise information about their exposure and also the timing of illness onset. And sometimes that's accompanied by their behavior associated with the exposure. And we can narrow down the possible left bound and right bound of the lower and upper bound of the exposure period so that the estimation of the incubation period is possible. So using the doubly interval sensor, the likelihood function, the incubation period distribution was estimated as shown on this slide. And the mean was estimated to be about the order of 5.5 days, as I remember correctly, I hope. Yeah. And still, we were able to have a fun with natural history. So the subsequent subject was the serial interval estimation. Serial interval represents the time from illness onset in a primary case to the illness onset in his or her secondary case. And usually the serial interval is expected to be longer than the incubation period. For instance, if the symptomatic transmission happens, suppose that the triangle represents the time of infection, okay? And in a primary case, the incubation period is the length of this continuous arrow, and the illness onset happens at the field circle, okay? And if the transmission happens after the illness onset of the primary case, the secondary case infection time comes after the illness onset of the primary case. And consequently, the serial interval, which is measured from the time of illness onset in the primary case to the illness onset in the secondary case, should be longer than the incubation period. And this was actually the case for the SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, from 2002 to 2003. And that it was known that the transmissibility of SARS was highest around a matter of 5 to 7 days since the illness onset, or shortly before developing pneumonia. And that was known as the factor of the success of the control by means of the case isolation and the contact tracing. And the figures, 3 panel figures that are shown on this slide, what I extracted from the paper of the Christoph Fraser, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And what it indicated is that SARS was quite different from other diseases in that the majority of secondary transmission took place after many days after illness onset. But in the case of COVID, it was rather different. The serial interval mean appeared to be slightly shorter than the incubation period. And what it means is graphically shown here. So the primary case infection happens there. And following the incubation period, he or she develops the illness. And when he or she develops the illness, the secondary transmission could have already happened there. And compared with the incubation period, the serial interval could be shorter. And even more difficult case can appear in the third example. The primary case is infected there, and he or she experiences the illness onset there. And the secondary transmission happens there. And the secondary case develops the illness shortly before the illness onset of the primary case. Then the serial interval could be even what it could take is a negative value. And what we have seen here is that once collecting the data set of the serial interval, what it allows us to estimate the serial interval, the mean serial interval of the COVID-19 was on the order of 4 to 5 days. On the other hand, the severe acute respiratory syndrome has got the serial interval mean of about 8.4 days. And that from this figure, my feeling was very bad around that time. Unfortunately, the serial interval, short serial interval of COVID-19 indicates that the majority of transmission take place before illness onset. And the relative frequency of the pre-symptomatic transmission around was estimated to be on the order of 40% around that time already. And my feeling from that type of natural history research around that time was that considering that 40% of secondary transmission could take place shortly before the illness onset, perhaps it's not very hopeful to contain this disease by means of case isolation and contact tracing. therefore, my comment to the general media when I announced that research news was quite negative. And still, the natural history clarification continued. But our data source has changed gradually at the end of February. So this figure shows what it happened when the Japanese resident evacuated from Wuhan. There were the matter of the 20,000 residents resided in the Wuhan city. And if we consider the Hubei and Hunan, the number of residents was much greater. And around that time, what the Japanese government offered is evacuation flight. There were in total 5 flights that departed from the airport of Wuhan, bringing the Japanese residents back to their home country via the Tokyo airport. And around that time, the entry screening was conducted to see if there was any suspicious symptom. And all evacuees were actually quarantined, and their movement was restricted at a nearby hotel, and for a matter of 14 days. And during that period, when the suspicious symptom appeared, all of the evacuees undertook laboratory testing. And when they were released, they also undertook laboratory testing. And while I was checking this type of scheme on the whiteboard with my lab members, we wondered how we should interpret this data set and how we should play with this data, what this data set indicates. And what we have seen from the Bayes theorem shown below this figure is that probability of asymptomatic infection given infection, what it means is the asymptomatic ratio, is given by that equation. And that's actually the Bayes theorem. And using that observed values shown as small letters, we have found that simply dividing the asymptomatic positive by the total of positive, that should give the asymptomatic ratio. This is, just a simple interpretation, but by the time that we derived this type of equation, we was quite unsure that if we were able to estimate the asymptomatic ratio from the evacuees data. But having the Bayes theorem, we became more and more certain that we are able to estimate this important quantity based on the evacuees data. And out of the total of 13 positive, in total, the number of evacuees was on the order of 580 something. And out of those 580 something, the 13 tested positive. And of these, the 5 are asymptomatic. And so the asymptomatic ratio was simply estimated to be 5/13, about 33%. And that was quite important information around that time to understand the natural history of this disease. And about that time, I'm still smiling at the press conference to explain the natural history data that we have found. But things have started to drastically change once we had invited that ship. The cruise ship has immediately appeared on the ocean nearby the port of Yokohama. And on February 3rd, the epidemic was noticed. And prior to that event, there was a suspicion of the appearance or the occurrence of the abnormal number of febrile cases. But by that time, it was very difficult to determine that the outbreak was going on. And once that outbreak is noticed, immediately the Japanese government received a notification. And from the 5th of February, by the 3rd of February, the suspected cases turned out to be positive with COVID-19. And therefore, the government decided to implement the on-board quarantine. The total number of passengers and crew members on board was the order of 3,700 on Diamond Princess. And it was too challenging for the Japanese government to allow everyone to disembark immediately on the port of Yokohama. And based on the principle, what the government decided is to restrict the movement within the cruise ship. And so everyone has its own personal room, and therefore the people were not allowed to come out from that room. And that has continued for 2 weeks. And the disembarkation procedure has taken place, and by the 19th of February, all of them disembarked. And here is based on the symptoms, how many cases tested positive is shown. So the number of cases started to grow from around that date of notification. And the orange bar shows the close contact of passengers, and the gray bars represent the passengers whose source of infection is not clarified. And once that passengers were quarantined, their infection has started to decline, but the crew members has caused an outbreak somehow in a later phase, and that has caused another problem on board. And this slide shows how the cases spread across different floors on the Diamond Princess. The Diamond Princess is an 18-floor cruise ship. And from around the 8th floor, deck 8, up until the deck 14 is where the majority of passengers are residing. And if we going upward, indicates that the quality of the room becomes better. Yeah? And as you notice here, the red dots and also the orange dots indicate those who are confirmed. And when the outbreak was noticed, and we did this type of mapping over time, and what we noticed is that when the outbreak was noticed, the cases spread across different floors, and also across different parts of the deck. And unfortunately, once it was noticed, it was almost too late to expect to contain the outbreak on board, and it became the very difficult disaster, and about the matter of the 20% of passengers and crews experienced the infection. But if we implement the sort of what we call the back calculation, for instance, suppose that I of t is incidence of infection, and f of s is incubation period that Natalie Linton and colleagues estimated. Then the convolution of the two would give the expectation of the illness onset on calendar time t. And here, what the figures show is that the number of new infections as a function of the estimated date of infection. So imposing the step function model, the highest frequency of secondary transmission was expected to have been from the 2nd of February up until the 5th of February. And among the passengers, both with and without close contact with a roommate, both infection frequency abruptly dropped from the 5th of February, indicating that the on-board quarantine was extremely successful in reducing the number of redundant contact here. And if we fit the generalized logistic model, the so-called Richards model that some of our Canadian colleagues are also using to yield the real-time forecasting. What the continuous lines show is the observed fit to the dataset. But fitting this model up until 4th of February only, and leave it as it was, the dashed lines, what it could have been observed. And here the orange line shows the passengers with close contact, and the blue line is a passenger without close contact. And without the movement restriction, it could have been the case that a matter of 2,000 out of 3,700 experienced the infection. And so this type of analysis strongly supports that Japanese policy to have implemented the onboard quarantine was quite successful, and estimating the effective reproduction number by generation, where the first date of generation is shown inside this panel. Reproduction number also shows the abrupt decline following the onboard quarantine period. And in the end, without causing too much trouble, the Japanese government had somewhat managed the initial disaster with this Diamond Princess. But as the time went by, that's what it happened around the early February, up until the 19th of February. But around that time, already the number of importations have increased. And initially, we received the majority of importations directly from China, as Japan is closely connected with China. And also when it came into the period of March, then here the red bars indicate the imported cases, while gray bars are local cases. The pandemic has started in Europe, and the country has started to import those cases from numerous European countries. And unfortunately, the major epidemic has become unavoidable. And prior to that type of event, our approach without too much resource was very limited. And what we were able to do rested on the finding of this type of offspring distribution. So this figure shows how the offspring distribution shaped during that first phase, early phase of the COVID-19 outbreaks in Japan. So the majority of cases did not cause secondary transmission, or at most 1 or 2 secondary cases. And sometimes we had some super spreading events. And in the beginning, we sought for some common features of the epidemic. And what we have found is that in a closed environment with close contact. And another common feature was that when that environment was humid, we have seen the secondary transmission. Sometimes that was a drinking party. Sometimes that was the use of the fitness gym or within the hospital. The transmission was restricted to that type of inside environment with a close contact. And that information, along with additional pieces of the cluster datasets, led us to form this type of a concept. Nowadays, this is distributed as 3C by the WHO: crowded environment and close proximity, and closed environment. Yeah, close contact in the crowded environment and closed space. And that informing this to the public, our approach was to expect people's behavior change. And in addition to that promotion, we implemented the forward and backward contact tracing so that additional pieces of data are collected, and also the additional generations of cases can be prevented. But in the beginning, this is a figure of the emergence of cases in Hokkaido on 28th of February. This was just a fourth day of our cluster busters team at the Ministry of Health. So we decided to implement a cluster busters approach, but on that fourth day, immediately in Hokkaido, the northernmost part of Japan, we have seen a bunch of cases across different parts of Hokkaido. But the numbers in the circle represent the number of confirmed cases diagnosed. And Hokkaido itself is as small as the size of the Netherlands. And around here is the capital city, Sapporo. And a few weeks before the emergence of the bunch of cases, there was a very well-known snow festival in early February. And that was followed by the emergence of the massive number of cases across different parts of Hokkaido. And it led us to suspect that Sapporo acts as an epicenter. And if we leave the situation as it is, it may be difficult to control the disease. And also, even with the concept of the cluster busters, looking at this figure, as you can imagine, it was not very hopeful to trace the contact already at around that time. Therefore, what we did was to advise the governor of the Hokkaido to declare the state of emergency or in his original manner. So still, the Japanese government hasn't decided to do anything, but the governor decided to request the people to self-restrain the contact. And from the date of the 28th of February, for a matter of 20 days, the Hokkaido went into the period of the sort of the semi-lockdown, but without any legal binding. So people were requested to stay in the home during the first weekend, and subsequently, the people were advised to reduce the contact, and the high-risk contact during the drinking party was informed, but no particular request for the drinking shops or the bars to shut down. And also, only based on the request basis, the reproduction number in Hokkaido declined below the value of 1 successfully. And this has helped us to form a sort of what we call the Hokkaido model. And while the Hokkaido only was quite successful in reducing the number of cases transiently, the number of imported cases continuously increased, and that has fueled the first wave of the epidemic in Japan. And this is based on the date of illness onset. And when it turned into the April period, it was quite clear to us that the exponential increase has started. And what we have had to do is that, around that time, we weren't unsure about the details of the heterogeneous patterns of contact. And all estimates were accompanied by huge uncertainty. And therefore, we were, while cluster busters approach was continued, we weren't quite sure if the major epidemic can be curbed by only targeting the high-risk host. And therefore, what the entire Japanese government did was to request the people to reduce the contact by 80%. And I was responsible for advising that type of thing in a scientific manner. And the underlying model was quite simple. Suppose that reproduction number was on the matter of 2.5 based on the European model. And also that effective reproduction number during the exponential growth period in Tokyo was on the order of 2.3. Then the exponential curve applies. And once we declare the state of emergency at the time S, then the subsequent exponential growth rate is changed. And the convoluting I of t or I dash of t along with the incubation period will get some expected epidemic curve by as a function of the date of illness onset. And what I persuaded the government is that if we reduce the contact by 70%, then it takes about a matter of 1 month. But if we can reduce the 80%, we can quickly reduce the contact to the level that cluster busters approach can be restarted. And that was the principal reason why that the 80% was requested in Japan. And we legally, we were not able to implement the legal lockdown requested by the government because we did not expect to do that in advance. And all of the contact reductions that the Japanese government has done was self-restraint based ones. So everyone was requested to cooperate with the government on a voluntary basis. And during that restraint period, of course, we weren't unsure how far the contact was reduced. And the people's movement was monitored using that geographic point system information of the mobile phone. So all in Japan, we have 3 major carriers of the mobile phone, and all 3 carriers have agreed to share the mobile phone data information without any individual identification to the Ministry of Health in real time. And we had an opportunity to monitor how many people have been reduced in a relative sense compared to the same day in the previous year. And that's what it's expected to be correlated with the total number of reduced contact. So as we have the 80% reduction of people, even without any behavioral change, we could anticipate that 80% of contact is reduced, of course. And therefore, based on that frequency-dependent assumption, we have monitored the reduced contact over time. And fortunately, during the period of the extensive reduction of the contact across the country, the effective reproduction number was maintained below the value of 1. So the declaration of the state of emergency by the way, the bars show the epidemic curve by the estimated date of infection based on the back calculation. And the blue lines what it represents the effective reproduction number. And during the period of state of emergency from around the 7th of April, the Prime Minister has declared the state of emergency, and it was lifted up after on 13th of May for 39 prefectures, and 25th of May for all prefectures, the restraint request was lifted up. But prior to that, the effective reproduction number was elevated a little bit. But during the most important period, when that massive number of contact reduction was requested, the effective reproduction number was, only based on the request, it was maintained to be below the value of 1. And it was the first instance that even the modelers were requested to sit next to the infectious disease expert to correspond to the press. And during that self-restraint period, everyone is watching the TV. And so without any expectation, that it has become difficult for me to walk outside freely. And during
Why, Hiroshi? People
Yes.
hate you for?
Yeah.
I'm joking. So because you made a recommendation of quarantine 80%?
No, I think it's because he became very popular.
Yeah, good. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I have only five or six remaining slides, so let me quickly go over. Yeah. And so if we separate the block that period into three, shortly before the declaration of the state of emergency and during the period of the state of emergency, and then the reproduction number dropped quite sharply. But as we were able to anticipate, once the declaration of the state of emergency was lifted up, the resurgence of cases was anticipated, and which was actually the case for many other countries. And it's what it actually happened. So once the declaration of the state of emergency was lifted, the number of cases started to grow again, especially in the epicenter Tokyo. And the reproduction number, effective reproduction number, was maintained to be above the value of 1. And politicians was a little worried about the economic impact of that self-restrained lockdown again, and therefore no strong intervention was implemented during that resurgence period. But from the first wave of the epidemic, what we have learned is that heterogeneous feature is visible in the data set. So in the beginning of the outbreak, what we have seen is that there was a surge in the number of cases in nighttime, and that at the bars and also the sort of the serviced lounges by women, and sometimes by men, there was an increase in the number of cases, and that was followed in the surge in the number of cases in the household and also the healthcare facilities. And we wondered if the nighttime acts as a core host of the transmission. And now that we have quantified the two type of host next generation matrix to describe the transmission dynamics, namely those who are at a high risk and low risk. And that can be labeled by nighttime hospitals and otherwise. Yeah. And we have implemented the real-time forecasting along with projection scenarios to see that what would happen if we reduce some proportion of the contact in that high-risk areas. And we have seen in real time, and we gave this feedback to the government in real time, that that if about 40% of the high-risk contact can be reduced in a self-restrained manner or based on the governmental advice, then the reproduction number, which is obtained as a dominant eigenvalue of that next generation matrix, can take the value below 1. And because of that type of advice and because of the interventions in the high-risk areas, the second wave have started to peak out in Japan by now. But that became to take place in August, and the number of cases has grown massively. And in the meantime, the important concern that we came to have was the surge in the number of inpatients in the hospitals. So the left-hand side shows the Osaka data set, which represents the urban areas. The right-hand side is Hokkaido. And fitting the model to the data as a function of the different age groups. And the bottom two panels shows what we obtained based on the fitting to the age-dependent data set. And what we have wanted to do is to expect how many cases are expected by the different timing of the declaration of the state of emergency, and how high the peak incidence, and not only the peak incidence, but the prevalence of admitted cases would be based on the threshold that we have predetermined to restrict the people's movement. And here, what the three panels in the top and the bottom indicates is that if we implement the self-restraint policy to request to reduce the contact, one day after that the cases exceeded the threshold, then how long it will take for it to come back to the cluster busters level, and how high the peak prevalence of hospitals would be. And what it indicates is that if we delay the decision data for a matter of 1 week, then the length of that state of emergency is extended for much longer than the 1 week, and expected the hospital cases will be far greater than what it is showing here, what it should have been with a 1 day delay or something like that. And so we requested that the politicians to decide early if we have to decide. Yeah, but the decline, relative decline of the GDP value from April to June in Japan was 20-something%, and that had a huge impact on their decision. So what we got is that Japan has a focus on the heterogeneity, while the 80% total reduction of the contact was the only option in the first instance, unfortunately. But during the stochastic phase in the beginning, we took the cluster busters approach to target the high-risk location, and also requested the general public to avoid the risky contact. And in the deterministic phase, even in the deterministic phase, we believe that we could do the high-risk approach. And that's represented by the NITO club and also the hospital and the welfare facilities. And the reduction of the high-risk contact can be projected in real time. And second wave experience has shown that if we implement that type of approach efficiently at an early phase, then we could avoid the massive increase of the number of cases. And now we have the scientific question about the goal of interventions by the time of the mass vaccination. So we have to maintain the hospital capacity, as we were much worried to see that the case in Italy, the hospitals in Italy was almost fallen, and the massive number of nosocomial transmissions took place. And we have wanted to avoid that as a minimal goal. And in the second wave, we have allowed the number of cases to grow and ensured only that the hospital capacity is maintained. But we are unsure if that approach was optimal. And unfortunately, it's very, very certain that the third and the fourth waves are expected to come to the entire part of Japan. And therefore, by those waves, our group goal is to show that what would be the alternative decision to seek for the optimal economic damage. Yeah, that's all for today from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiroshi. I think now we would allow people to raise the hand, and we'll unmute you so you can ask a question directly to Hiroshi. But let me start first. Thank you, first of all, Hiroshi, for coming. I know this is your midnight, and I know you're still very busy, heavily involved with the Japan's effort. I have two questions. First question is, what is really the flu season in Japan? It's normally starting in October?
Diplomacy, you mean that financial year? Or...
No, I'm talking about seasonal flu.
Season of influenza is usually from around mid-January up until mid-March.
Oh, I see. Okay, good. Yeah, so it's pretty much like here in Canada. Yeah. So any consideration about that? What's going to happen if continuing the school opening and coming to a flu season, and it's going to be difficult to distinguish between two diseases?
Yes, we are already very much worried about that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the strange phenomenon that we have seen is that during the last winter, the influenza incidence was quite small.
True. Yeah.
We are unsure if it was because of the people's behavior or you know, some other factors, and that what we anticipate for the next winter is that you know, at least the partial vaccination is expected to start in this winter, and therefore the symptoms of the high-risk persons will be even more complicated, and therefore the flow of the febrile individuals at the hospital facilities would be extremely complex. And therefore, what the government can do at the moment is to promote at least the elderly to undertake the influenza vaccination in advance. And you know, the level of promotion is slightly intensified compared to the ordinary years. And that we anticipate that you know, there will be the shortage of influenza vaccine as well. Yeah. And not, you know, that not necessarily the host who are determined to receive vaccination, but some other hosts who are not necessarily at high risk of infection may wish to receive vaccine. And therefore, that you know, the governmental control of that type of vaccination is an ongoing issue.
Thank you. So I want to let other people ask a question first.
John, could I ask a question?
Yeah, of course, Kumar, of course.
So firstly, Hiroshi, thank you. Very, very interesting talk, and also interesting to see that many of the things we're worried about here are things about and have analyzed carefully. We're also worried about the economic impact, the second wave. You're already talking about a third and fourth wave. We are worried about a second wave. In the heterogeneity also, we've observed the same thing. But in your graph, I think it was slide 33, I wonder if you could show the largest part just was classified as other. Is that something we can't say anything more about?
33.
Yeah, where you were showing the heterogeneity.
Yes. Well, you know, this green line.
Oh, yes, yes.
I don't, they are designated as you know, unknown, but part of them should have been connected to the nightclub. But you know, the reminders are actually unknown, unfortunately. And that in the second wave, the composition of cases was not like this, but the majority of cases were represented by the nighttime exposure. And so that you know, depending on the contact behavior, the composition of cases are expected to change. But at least you know, from this green curve, what I can tell you is that they were attributed to either some other clusters contact, for instance, exposure at within the company building, or some other you know, inside the exposure other facilities. What it explains the green curve.
So here also the view is that we now have to shift our modeling efforts to look at regional modeling or clusters, different kinds of facilities, and then the idea is that successive waves, the strategy would be to contain them as quickly as possible. They will occur, but to try to not occur, ensure that they don't communicate from one cluster to another. On the economic side, it's also very interesting. A lot of discussion going on here. Some of us are working on that, and we were interested to see that you also started noticing at some point. Maybe not now, but maybe we should compare notes on what we're thinking about in those regards. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I don't see any people raise their hand, so I will ask another question. So again, this is anticipation for the future. So any thought about what is going to happen about Olympics? So if soon vaccine might become available, it's kind of emergency vaccine, could that be integrated into part of planning for the mass gathering, including the Olympic?
Ooh.
Because we're thinking about other sports here, but I think Olympic is more dominant.
Yeah, you know that I have checked that published efficacy and biological actions of the vaccines against the coronavirus for dogs and cats. Unfortunately, we don't have the data set for humans, and
Right.
we have to wait for the clinical studies in humans. And what I have seen with the systematically reviewed dog and cat data is that both live vaccine and also the other type of vaccine, the efficacy was not necessarily very high. And what I can anticipate from that is that the vaccine effectiveness in humans may not be that high. And therefore, what we could do around this time is to compute the scenarios in which the different trajectories by different functional effect of vaccines is in place. And so that, for instance, we can say, expect that the transmission blocking vaccine may not necessarily be in place, and rather it could simply ease the symptoms among high-risk persons, and that could complicate the diagnosis of cases. And that's sort of the worst case scenario. And also even provided that the transmission blocking scenario is realistically expected, we have to decide whether we should vaccinate the elderly first or nighttime first.
Mm-hmm.
From the next generation matrix in Japan and also in other countries, it could be the case that we should possibly vaccinate persons in the nightclub as a first prioritized host to elevate the herd immunity. But ethically, perhaps it's more sound for the general public to vaccinate the frontline workers in the hospitals and also elderly who are at high risk of the death once infected. And therefore, that type of debate should be intensified. But at the moment, I haven't seen the extensive discussion about the validity of vaccinating people in the nightclub.
Yeah, the problem is the contact tracing with nightclub is difficult to identify the exposure. Other questions? I know some people ask me private questions, but I think they're here. But anybody want to raise hand, ask Hiroshi the question directly, or? Maybe we should stop here, and I will pass on to Kuma. But again, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Canadian, your colleagues, Hiroshi. I know you have lots of collaborators here, and for your time and for your expertise. And good luck with your work with the Minister of Japan, and good luck with your interventions. Kuma, I pass on to you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'll just repeat what John Hong said. Thank you very much. It was a very informative talk. Also very interesting to see how you're worried about the same things we're worried about. So really, it would be good to have more conversations. Good luck to you in your work. And I think really we're entering a new phase probably all over the world of the virus. And so it's going to require a little bit of modifications in the way we approach it from the first phase. So I'd love to have further conversations with you about that. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. See you all next week then. Keep everyone stay safe, keep well, and we'll see you next Tuesday for the seminar again. Thanks. Bye.